The clinking of a silver fork against porcelain was the only sound that dared to challenge the opulent silence of the Azure Spire. At the highest table, overlooking the glittering expanse of downtown Chicago, sat Richard Blackwood, a man whose net worth was a number with too many commas for most to comprehend. His life was a fortress of calculated transactions and sterile luxury. But tonight, that fortress was about to be breached, not by a corporate rival or a market crash, but by a soft-spoken waitress with tired eyes and a secret etched into her memory. A secret that began with a simple star-shaped birthmark and a sentence that would shatter his world. "Hi, sir." My father had the same birthmark. The world of Richard Blackwood was one of meticulously curated perfection. It existed in the hushed tones of boardrooms, the silent glide of his private jet, and the sterile museum-like quality of his penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. At 52, he had a face that was more a testament to expensive skin care and disciplined living than to the passage of time. His hair, a distinguished silver at the temples, was perfectly coiffed. His suit, a bespoke creation from a tailor in Savile Row, whose name was whispered with reverence, fit him like a second skin. He was the CEO of Blackwood Industries, a global conglomerate with tentacles in everything from technology to real estate. He was a king in a kingdom of his own making, but his throne was cold and his kingdom was empty. Tonight, he was dining alone at the Azure Spire, a restaurant so exclusive that reservations were a matter of legacy rather than availability. It was a familiar ritual, a way to mark the end of another profitable quarter. He didn't come for the food, though it was exquisite. He came for the silence, the deference, the invisible shield that his wealth provided. The other patrons, a collection of the city's elite, gave him a wide berth, their glances a mixture of awe and fear. He preferred it that way. Attachments were liabilities, and emotions were volatile variables he had long since eliminated from the equation of his life. His gaze drifted over the city lights, a tapestry of human striving that felt utterly alien to him. He remembered a time long ago, before the private schools, the Ivy League education, and the relentless climb up the corporate ladder. But the memories were hazy like faded photographs. He was an orphan, raised by a stern, unyielding grandfather who had groomed him to be his successor. His parents, he'd been told, had died in a tragic yachting accident when he was just 4 years old. He had no memory of them, only a single silver-framed photograph on his grandfather's desk of a handsome couple smiling into the sun. They were strangers to him. His grandfather, Arthur Blackwood, had never spoken of them, and Richard had learned early on not to ask. Grief was an indulgence the Blackwood heir could not afford. A shadow fell across his table. He looked up, his brow furrowing in annoyance at the interruption. A waitress stood there, holding a silver coffee pot. She looked young, perhaps in her early 20s, with a fatigue in her eyes that even the dim, flattering light of the restaurant couldn't hide. Her uniform was crisp, but her posture betrayed a weariness that spoke of long hours and little rest. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. He simply nodded, his attention already returning to the city below. He was accustomed to service staff, being invisible, efficient phantoms who catered to his needs without imposing their presence. But this one lingered. He could feel her gaze on him, and it was unnerving. He glanced back at her, his expression hardening. "Is there something else?" he asked, his tone clipped and dismissive. The young woman whose name tag read Evelyn flinched slightly but held her ground. Her eyes were fixed not on his face but on his left wrist, where his sleeve had ridden up slightly as he reached for his water glass. Exposed on the pale skin just above his hand was a peculiar birthmark, a small dark red constellation of dots that formed a near-perfect five-pointed star. It was a unique, indelible part of him, something he rarely thought about. Evelyn's breath hitched. Her face, already pale, lost another shade of color. She seemed to be wrestling with a decision, her hands tightening on the coffee pot. The normal professional distance of a server had vanished, replaced by an intense, personal scrutiny that Richard found both intrusive and baffling. "I asked if there was something else," he repeated, his voice now edged with ice. He had a reputation for being ruthless in business, a reputation he had meticulously cultivated. He did not suffer fools, nor did he tolerate breaches of protocol. The waitress Evelyn swallowed hard. The clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the low hum of conversation from other tables seemed to fade into a dull roar in her ears. For a moment, she looked like she was going to turn and flee. Instead, she took a shallow breath, her gaze lifting from his wrist to meet his cold, grey eyes. The words came out in a rush, a quiet torrent of sound that would irrevocably alter the course of his perfectly ordered life. "Hi, sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence that enveloped his table with the force of a physical blow. "My father, he had the same birthmark." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and yet impossibly heavy. Richard Blackwood stared at the waitress. His mind, usually a seamless engine of logic and calculation, failing to process the statement. It was absurd. A coincidence. The rambling of a star-struck or perhaps mentally unstable employee. His first instinct was to summon the manager to have this disruption removed from his presence immediately. "I beg your pardon," he said, his voice dangerously low. It was the tone he used just before terminating a multi-million-dollar deal or firing a senior executive. It was a warning, but Evelyn didn't seem to hear the threat in his voice. Her focus was entirely consumed by the star-shaped mark on his wrist. It was identical. The size, the deep crimson color, the precise arrangement of the 5 points. It was the mark from the single dog-eared photograph she kept in a small wooden box under her bed, a photograph of a young man she had never met. The man her mother had called the love of her life. Her father. "The birthmark," she repeated a little stronger this time, pointing with a slightly trembling finger. "On your wrist. It's exactly the same. My mother used to say it was his star, that it meant he was destined for great things." Richard's jaw tightened. He instinctively pulled his cuff down, hiding the mark from her sight, as if she had exposed a deep and private vulnerability. "That is a ridiculous assertion. I can assure you, you are mistaken." "No," she insisted, shaking her head, a lock of brown hair falling across her forehead. The fear in her eyes was now mixed with a desperate conviction. "I'm not. I've stared at the only picture I have of him my entire life. I'd know it anywhere." The very idea was preposterous. His father was James Blackwood. He had died at sea, a tragic hero of a story his grandfather had relayed with stoic finality. He was a scion of a wealthy family, a man who sailed yachts, not a man whose daughter was waiting tables to make ends meet. The two worlds could not possibly intersect. And yet, the girl's certainty was unsettling. It wasn't the fawning of someone looking for a handout or the delusion of a fantasist. It was raw, unshakable belief. "What is your name?" he demanded, his mind shifting from dismissal to interrogation. Evelyn Reed. And your father, Miss Reed." "What was his name?" A shadow of pain crossed her face. I don't know his last name. My mother only ever called him Daniel. She met him one summer a long time ago. He was a musician traveling through. They fell in love, but he had to leave. He promised he'd come back for her for me, but he never did. Daniel, a musician. The details only solidified Richard's certainty that this was a foolish mistake. His father's name was James. He was a businessman, an heir, not a wandering musician. My father's name was James Blackwood, Richard stated flatly. He died along with my mother when I was 4. You have made a mistake, a very serious one. Now, if you'll excuse me. He gestured dismissively, expecting her to retreat, chastened and embarrassed. But she didn't move. Tears welled in her eyes, born not of sadness, but of frustration and a profound, earth-shattering confusion. "But the mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It can't be a coincidence. It's too perfect." The manager, a sleek man named Gerard, with an perpetually anxious expression, had noticed the prolonged interaction and was now gliding towards their table. His face was a mask of polite panic. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Blackwood?" Gerard asked pointedly, ignoring Evelyn, though his eyes shot daggers at her. Richard looked from the anxious manager to the distraught young woman. He could destroy her. A single word from him, and she would be fired, her name likely blacklisted from every high-end establishment in the city. That was the easy, logical path. It was the Blackwood way. Tidy up loose ends. Eliminate complications. But something held him back. It was the raw sincerity in her eyes. It was the mention of a detail so specific, so personal. The birthmark wasn't a well-known fact. It was rarely visible, and he never discussed it. How could she possibly know of it? The word she had used, destiny. It was a foolish, romantic notion, the kind of concept his grandfather had beaten out of him decades ago. Yet for the first time in a very long time, a crack had appeared in the smooth, impenetrable facade of his reality. A tiny hairline fracture of doubt. He looked at Evelyn, who stood braced for the inevitable blow. He saw not a manipulative schemer, but a young woman clinging to a desperate hope. "Everything is fine, Gerard," Richard said, his voice startlingly calm. The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Miss Reed and I were just concluding a conversation." He turned his gaze back to Evelyn. He pulled a pen from his jacket pocket and scribbled a number on a napkin. It was the private line for his personal assistant. "I am still certain you are mistaken," he said, his voice retaining its authority, but losing some of its earlier ice. "However, your conviction is intriguing. Have my assistant schedule a meeting for you with my attorney. We will get to the bottom of this. In the meantime, I suggest you say nothing of this to anyone." He pushed the napkin across the table. Evelyn stared at it as if it were a life raft. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and nodded, unable to speak. "Now," Richard said, his professional mask firmly back in place. "I would like my coffee." As Evelyn turned to comply, her mind reeling, Richard stared out at the city lights again. They no longer looked so distant. A single, impossible question had been asked, and now, for the first time since he was a small child, Richard Blackwood felt the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of not knowing the answer. The following days were a study in cognitive dissonance for Richard Blackwood. On the surface, nothing changed. He chaired board meetings with his usual incisive authority, dissected financial reports with merciless precision, and navigated billion-dollar negotiations with the impassive calm of a chess grandmaster. He was the epitome of control. Yet beneath the surface, Evelyn Reed's words echoed relentlessly, a discordant note in the carefully composed symphony of his life. My father had the same birthmark. The statement was a virus that had infected his certainty. He found himself subconsciously touching his wrist, the familiar pattern of the starburst, suddenly feeling alien. He would catch his reflection in the polished chrome of an elevator or the dark screen of his phone, and see not a titan of industry, but a man with a question mark hanging over his very identity. Fragments of memory, long buried and ignored, began to surface at inconvenient moments. A flash of a woman's laughter, warm and bright, completely unlike the formal, somber women who had populated his grandfather's world. The scent of salt water and wild flowers, a smell he couldn't place. The feel of a rough, calloused hand holding his, the hand of a man who didn't wear a suit. Were these real memories? Or were they phantoms conjured by a waitress's strange claim? His grandfather Arthur had been adamant that Richard's mind played tricks on him, that trauma had muddled his recollections of the time before the accident. It had been easier to believe him to lock those fragments away. His first call was not to his assistant, but to Jonathan Vance, his chief legal counsel, and the closest thing he had to a friend. They met in Richard's office, a vast expanse of glass and steel that offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline. Jonathan, a sharp, pragmatic man in his late 40s, listened patiently as Richard recounted the incident at the Azure Spire, his face betraying no emotion. When Richard finished, Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. "A waitress," Jonathan said, his tone neutral, "claims her long-lost father, a musician named Daniel, has a birthmark identical to yours and is therefore your father, not James Blackwood, the man whose name is on this building." "When you put it like that, it sounds insane," Richard admitted, pacing in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It is, Richard. On a scale of 1 to 10 of legal headaches, this is a potential 12. This girl, Evelyn Reed, could be a simple opportunist looking for a payday. She sees a famous billionaire, notices a unique feature, and concocts a story. It's the oldest trick in the book." "She didn't ask for money," Richard countered. "And she seemed genuinely distressed. There was no artifice to it, John. It was raw." "The best ones are," Jonathan said dryly. "My advice, we have her sign an NDA and give her a modest settlement to compensate for her emotional distress. She disappears, and this whole thing goes away before the tabloids get a whiff of it." It was sound advice. It was the logical, strategic move. It was what Arthur Blackwood would have done without a moment's hesitation. But Richard couldn't shake the image of Evelyn's eyes, that desperate conviction. "No," Richard said, stopping his pacing. "I don't want to bury it. I want to know the truth." Jonathan sighed. "The truth, Richard? Your life is a matter of public record. Your birth certificate says James and Elizabeth Blackwood are your parents. Their death certificates are filed with the state. Your grandfather raised you. These are facts. Everything else is just noise." "Is it?" Richard shot back, his voice tight. "My grandfather controlled every piece of information I was ever given. He told me my parents loved sailing. I found out years later my mother was terrified of the water. He told me they died instantly. The coroner's report, which I dug up in college, said the cause of death was inconclusive. The bodies never recovered. He lied, John, at least by omission. What else did he lie about?" The admission hung in the air, a confession of a doubt Richard had harbored for decades. Jonathan's professional demeanor softened slightly. He knew of the cold, demanding relationship between Richard and his late grandfather. "All right," Jonathan said, leaning forward. "You want the truth, we'll find it. But we do this my way. Quietly. I'll hire the best private investigator in the country, a man named Gene Holloway. He's ex-FBI, discreet as a ghost. We'll vet this Evelyn Reed from the day she was born. We'll find out who she is, who her mother is, and if this Daniel ever existed." "Do it," Richard ordered. "I want to know everything." A few days later, Evelyn Reed, looking small and overwhelmed, was escorted into Jonathan Vance's impeccably appointed office. Jonathan was polite but firm, explaining that Mr. Blackwood took her claim seriously, and as such was initiating a thorough investigation. He had her sign a non-disclosure agreement, framing it as a standard procedure to protect all parties involved. Evelyn signed without hesitation. She didn't want money. She just wanted answers. She recounted her story again this time, with more detail. Her mother, Laura Reed, had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier. Laura had been a dreamer, a gentle soul, who had never truly recovered from her brief whirlwind romance with Daniel. He was a guitarist, she said with kind eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. He had the star on his wrist, and he'd told her it was his compass. He left their small Wisconsin town, promising to send for her as soon as he made a name for himself in Chicago. He wrote a few letters, and then nothing. Laura found out she was pregnant and waited. She waited her entire life. "All I have of him," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion, "is one photograph, and this." She reached into her blouse and pulled out a delicate silver locket. It was old and tarnished. She opened it. On one side was a tiny faded picture of her mother, young and radiant. On the other side was a picture of a man. He was laughing, his head tilted back, a guitar slung over his shoulder. He was handsome, with dark, unruly hair and a familiar jawline. And on the wrist of the hand holding the guitar's neck, just visible in the grainy photograph, was a small star-shaped smudge. Jonathan took a high-resolution photo of the locket's contents. As Evelyn left his office, he immediately forwarded the image to Richard. Richard opened the file, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the man in the photograph. The face was younger, happier, and free from the weight of a corporate empire, but there was no mistaking it. It was the face of the man from the silver-framed photograph on his grandfather's desk. The face of James Blackwood. But Evelyn had called him Daniel. Gene Holloway, the private investigator, worked with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a predator. Within 72 hours, the first reports began to filter into Jonathan Vance's office, which he then relayed to Richard. Each new piece of information was a spadeful of dirt being thrown onto the pristine, manicured lawn of Richard Blackwood's life, exposing the tangled, messy roots beneath. The first report confirmed the details of Evelyn Reed's life. She was born 26 years ago in Havenwood, Wisconsin, a small town that time had largely forgotten. Her mother Laura had worked as a librarian. They had lived a quiet, modest life. Evelyn had excelled in school, earning a partial scholarship to a state university, but had to drop out to care for her mother during her illness. Since Laura's death, Evelyn had been working 2 jobs to pay off medical debt and save enough to hopefully one day finish her degree. Holloway's report painted a picture of a resilient, hard-working young woman with no history of deceit or manipulation. She was in every verifiable way exactly who she appeared to be. The focus then shifted to Laura Reed. Holloway uncovered old yearbooks, town records, and spoke to a few of Havenwood's older residents. They remembered Laura as a sweet, quiet girl who had been swept off her feet one summer by a handsome, charismatic musician passing through with a small band. They confirmed his name was Daniel, and he played the guitar like a dream. He stayed for about 2 months, and he and Laura were inseparable. Then as quickly as he arrived, he was gone. Shortly after, the town gossip mill noted that Laura was pregnant. She never spoke of the father again, raising Evelyn on her own, with a quiet, unyielding devotion. So a musician named Daniel did exist, Richard mused, staring out his office window. This doesn't help us. It just confirms her story. Patience, Richard, Jonathan advised over the phone. Holloway is just getting started. He's digging into bands that might have played in that area of Wisconsin 27 years ago. It's a needle in a haystack, but the man finds needles. The next breakthrough came from a different angle. Holloway started digging into the official narrative of James and Elizabeth Blackwood. He pulled old newspaper articles about the yachting accident. The story was thin on details. The Serenity, the Blackwood family yacht, was reported lost during a sudden storm off the coast of North Carolina. A massive search effort had yielded only a few pieces of wreckage. No bodies were ever found. It was all very neat, very tragic. But Holloway was a man who pulled at threads. He found the name of the lead Coast Guard officer on the case, a man now retired and living in Florida. Holloway flew down to see him. The old officer, his memory still sharp, recalled the Blackwood case vividly, not because of the tragedy, but because of the interference. Old man Arthur Blackwood, the retired officer told Holloway. He was there every day, this grim-faced tycoon with an army of lawyers. He didn't seem interested in the search, only in managing the story. He shut us down earlier than he should have. Kept insisting we declare them dead. Said he needed to provide stability for his grandson. Something about it always felt wrong. Like he was burying a story, not a son. This information sent a chill down Richard's spine. His grandfather's grief had always seemed performative, a stoic display of loss. Now it felt like something else entirely. It felt like damage control. The true bombshell landed a week later. Holloway, having hit a wall trying to find a musician named Daniel, had changed tactics. He started searching for James Blackwood. He scoured old entertainment archives, small-town newspapers and music zines from that era, looking for any mention of the Blackwood heir outside of the society pages. And he found it. It was a grainy article from a short-lived Chicago music publication, dated the year before Richard's parents supposedly died. It was a review of a small folk rock band called Wanderingters. The article praised the band's lead guitarist for his soulful lyrics and intricate finger-picking. It included a blurry black-and-white photo of the band. In the center, holding a guitar, was the young man from Evelyn's locket. The caption beneath the photo identified him. It did not say James Blackwood. It said, lead guitarist Daniel Stone. Jonathan Vance presented the evidence in a sealed folder on Richard's desk. Richard opened it, his hands surprisingly steady. He read the article, his eyes lingering on the name. Daniel Stone. Not Daniel Reed, not James Blackwood. A new name, a new identity. My father, Richard said, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth, was a musician named Daniel Stone. He used a pseudonym. It appears so, Jonathan said carefully. James Blackwood, heir to the Blackwood fortune, moonlighted as a folk singer. It's a side of him your grandfather would have never tolerated. It makes sense he would keep it a secret. It's more than that, John, Richard said, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been scattered for a lifetime. Havenwood, Wisconsin. That's where he met Laura Reed. That must have been during a tour with his band. He wasn't James Blackwood, the heir to her. He was Daniel Stone, the musician. This explained why Evelyn's mother only knew him as Daniel. He had been living a double life, a life where he wasn't defined by his family's wealth and expectations, but by his passion for music, a life where he fell in love with a librarian in a small town. So he had an affair, Jonathan summarized, trying to ground the revelation in a familiar, sordid reality. He had a child with this woman and then went back to his wife Elizabeth and his son Hugh. The accident happened, and the secret died with him. It was a plausible theory, a neat, tidy box to put the messy truth into. But it didn't feel right to Richard. It felt too simple. Why would his grandfather go to such lengths to control the narrative of the accident? Why the lies about his mother's fear of water? And there was one more piece of the puzzle that Holloway had uncovered, a detail so strange and unsettling that Jonathan had hesitated to even mention it. Holloway had run a deep background check on Elizabeth Blackwood Richard's mother. Her maiden name was Parker. She came from a respectable but not wealthy family. But digging deeper, Holloway had found her original birth certificate. The name on it was not Elizabeth Parker. It was Laura Parker. Richard stared at Jonathan, his blood running cold. "What did you say? Your mother's birth name was Laura Elizabeth Parker," Jonathan said, his voice low. She went by Elizabeth in society circles, likely at Arthur's insistence. It sounded more dignified, but her family, her friends from before she met your father, they all knew her as Laura. Richard felt the floor drop out from beneath him. Laura, the name of the librarian in Havenwood, the name of Evelyn Reed's mother. It couldn't be. It was impossible. "Check the dates," Richard commanded, his voice hoarse. "When did Laura Reed die in Havenwood?" Jonathan already had the information. 5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. And my mother, Elizabeth Blackwood, died in the yachting accident 27 years ago. The dates didn't line up. It had to be a coincidence. A cruel, mind-bending coincidence. 2 different women named Laura, both involved with the same man. But Richard knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was not a coincidence. His grandfather had not just buried a story, he had buried a person, rewritten a life, and split a family in 2. The woman Evelyn Reed called her mother, and the woman Richard Blackwood called his mother, were somehow impossibly connected. The thread Holloway had been pulling hadn't just unraveled a secret. It had unraveled reality itself. The conference room Jonathan Vance had booked was a deliberate choice. It was in a neutral downtown office building, far from the imposing shadow of Blackwood Tower. It was anonymous, a sterile space with a polished mahogany table, bottled water, and a palpable sense of tension. Richard was there first, flanked by Jonathan. He had not slept in 2 days, his mind a whirlwind of names, dates, and impossibilities. The image of the laughing musician, Daniel Stone, was burned into his memory, a ghost who was simultaneously his father and a complete stranger. Evelyn arrived exactly on time. She was dressed not in her waitress uniform, but in a simple, dark blue dress. She looked nervous, but resolute, her hands clutching the strap of her purse. She sat opposite Richard, the wide expanse of the table feeling like a chasm between 2 separate realities. "Miss Reed," Jonathan began, his voice calm and professional. "Thank you for coming. As we discussed, our investigation has yielded some complex information. We wanted to share our findings with you directly." Richard held up a hand, silencing his lawyer. "Jonathan, thank you. I'll handle this." He looked directly at Evelyn, his grey eyes, usually so guarded, now filled with a raw, searching intensity. "Evelyn," he said, using her first name for the first time. "Everything you told me about your mother, Laura, and the musician named Daniel, it was true. We found evidence that he existed." A wave of relief washed over Evelyn's face, followed by a flicker of hope. "So, he was my father." "His name wasn't Daniel," Richard said, gently pushing a file across the table. "That was a name he used when he played music. His real name was James Blackwood. He was my father." Evelyn stared at him, her mind struggling to bridge the gap between the wandering guitarist her mother had described and the corporate titan sitting before her. "Your father, then? That means? It means we are brother and sister." Richard finished the sentence for her. The words felt momentous, world-altering, as he said them aloud. Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes, a mixture of shock, joy, and a lifetime of unanswered questions. She had a brother. She wasn't alone. The father she had only ever known, through a single photograph, had a family. Her family. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "There's more," Richard said, his expression turning grim. "And this is much harder to understand." Jonathan slid another set of documents across the table. They were reproductions of 2 birth certificates, one for Elizabeth Parker and one for Laura Reed. He then added a copy of a marriage license for James Blackwood and Elizabeth Parker. "This is my mother, Elizabeth," Richard explained, pointing to the documents. "But her birth name was Laura Elizabeth Parker. She went by Elizabeth." He then pointed to the other certificate. "And this is your mother, Laura Reed, from Havenwood, Wisconsin." Evelyn looked at the documents, confused. "They have the same first name. They are the same person." Richard said the words, landing with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn recoiled, as if she'd been struck. "What? No. That's impossible. My mother. She died 5 years ago. I was with her. I held her hand. I know," Richard said, his voice laced with his own profound confusion. "And my mother, Elizabeth Blackwood, officially died 27 years ago in a boating accident. The official records the story I was told my entire life says she is dead." The room fell silent. The statement was a paradox, a logical impossibility that defied every known fact of their lives. Evelyn shook her head, her hands trembling. "No, you're wrong. My mother was a librarian. She lived in a small town. She wasn't the wife of a billionaire. She never mentioned any of this. She was just my mom." "The woman you knew as Laura Reed," Richard pressed, leaning forward, his voice urgent. "Did she ever talk about her life before Havenwood? Before she met Daniel or James?" Evelyn thought back, sifting through years of memories. She said she grew up in a strict household. She never talked about her family. She said she needed to get away to start over. I always assumed she was running from something simple, like a controlling father. "My grandfather," Richard said, the name tasting like poison. "Arthur Blackwood. He was more than controlling. He was a tyrant who orchestrated lives as if they were corporate mergers. He despised my father's passion for music. He saw it as a weakness, a betrayal of the Blackwood legacy. And my mother. He thought she was too soft, not a suitable wife for his heir." A horrifying theory began to crystallize in Richard's mind, pieced together from the investigators' reports, the retired officer's suspicions, and the impossible reality sitting across the table from him. "The yachting accident," Richard said slowly, thinking aloud. "There were no bodies. My grandfather rushed to have them declared dead. He took control of the narrative. What if it wasn't an accident? Jonathan interjected. Richard, that's a serious allegation. What if it was a disappearance? Richard continued, his eyes locked on Evelyn's. What if my father James and my mother Laura decided to run away? To escape my grandfather's control. They could leave their old lives behind and start fresh. He could be Daniel Stone, the musician, and she could be Laura, a simple librarian. They could be free. It was a romantic, desperate plan, the kind of plan two people deeply in love might conceive. But something went wrong. Richard continued, the pieces clicking into place with dreadful certainty. They must have been separated. My grandfather. He must have found them. He couldn't have his heir and his wife vanishing, creating a scandal. So he created a better story, a tragic accident at sea. It was clean final. It preserved the family's reputation. Evelyn stared at him, her face ashen. If he found them, what did he do to my father? Richard had no answer, only a cold, sickening feeling in the pit of his stomach. Arthur Blackwood was a man who eliminated problems. And my mother? Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. If she was your mother, then... What about you? Where were you? This was the question that had tormented Richard for the past 48 hours. The single silver-framed photograph of his parents, his hazy, fragmented memories of a time before the cold, sterile mansion. I was 4 years old, he said. I was supposed to be on the yacht with them. That was the official story. My grandfather said at the last minute I developed a fever and was left with a nanny. But I have a memory, a flash of being in a car at night. My mother, she was crying. She was telling me to be a good boy. She was handing me over to someone. The collision of worlds was complete. The two narratives of their lives had crashed together, leaving behind a wreckage of lies. The woman Evelyn had known and loved as her mother Laura Reed was also Laura Blackwood, a woman who had been declared dead for nearly 3 decades. She had not abandoned her son. She had been forced to. She had lived out her life in hiding in a self-imposed exile, raising her daughter while mourning the son and the husband she had lost. And Evelyn the waitress was not just the forgotten child of a wandering musician. She was Evelyn Blackwood, the daughter of the same man Richard called his father, and the living, breathing proof that the foundation of Richard's entire life was a monstrous, calculated lie. To find the truth, they had to go back to the beginning. Not their beginning, but the one that had been stolen. Gene Holloway, armed with the new explosive theory, focused his investigation on the weeks surrounding the supposed yachting accident. He dug into Arthur Blackwood's financial records, phone logs, and private correspondence from that period. What he found was not a smoking gun, but a series of cold, hard, and damning transactions. He found the architect of their family's destruction. The story, as pieced together from Holloway's meticulous research and the inferences they were forced to make, was more tragic than they could have imagined. Jonathan presented it to Richard and Evelyn in that same neutral conference room, the air thick with the ghosts of the past. James Blackwood, known to the world as a dutiful heir, had been living a lie for years. His true passion was music, a world Arthur viewed with utter contempt. His marriage to Laura Parker was genuine. He loved her deeply, but she, too, felt suffocated by Arthur's oppressive control. The birth of their son Richard only tightened the gilded cage. James saw his son's future laid out for him, a carbon copy of his own loveless, duty-bound existence, and he rebelled. His escape was music. As Daniel Stone, he wasn't a Blackwood. He was just a man with a guitar and a song. During a small Midwest tour with his band, he met Laura again. Not a new Laura, but his Laura. This was their plan. She had quietly established a new identity for herself in Havenwood, Wisconsin, as Laura Reed, a woman with no past. It was their intended destination, their sanctuary. The plan was simple and desperate. They would stage an accident. They would take the Serenity, outsail it far offshore, and abandon it, leaving just enough wreckage for the authorities to find. They had a second, smaller, untraceable boat waiting. From there, they would disappear. James would become Daniel Stone permanently, and Laura Blackwood would cease to exist, allowing Laura Reed to live. They would retrieve their son Richard as soon as it was safe and start their new life together in Havenwood. It almost worked. They staged the accident perfectly. The storm provided the ideal cover. They made it to their getaway boat and were heading north under the cover of darkness. But Arthur Blackwood was not a man to be underestimated. He had always been suspicious of his son's long business trips and his daughter-in-law's growing melancholy. He had hired his own investigators long before the accident. He wasn't just tracking his son, he was tracking his assets. And James had made one crucial mistake. He had used a Blackwood-funded account to purchase the second boat. Arthur's men were waiting for them at a small private dock in Virginia. There was no violent confrontation. Arthur was more subtle than that. He simply appeared a cold spectre on the pier, his presence more intimidating than any weapon. What followed was a choice and ultimatum delivered with chilling calm. Arthur explained that they could not be allowed to disgrace the family name. The accident story would proceed as planned. They were for all intents and purposes dead. He gave Laura a choice. She could disappear, live out her life as Laura Reed, and raise the child she was now secretly carrying, Evelyn. He would provide a modest, untraceable trust to ensure she never wanted for anything, on the condition that she never contact the Blackwood family again. She would have to give up her firstborn son, Richard, forever. If she refused, he would use his immense power to have James, declared mentally unstable, take custody of Richard himself and ensure she never saw either of them again. He would destroy James's reputation and crush his spirit completely. To James, the ultimatum was different. Arthur knew that James's weak point was his love for his family. Arthur told him that if he went with Laura, he would hunt them down. But if James agreed to come back to kill Daniel Stone forever and become the heir he was meant to be, Arthur would allow Laura to live her life in peace with their unborn child. He would raise Richard, and James would never see his wife or his new child again. It was a choice between his family being separated and his family being destroyed. Torn apart, defeated, and fearing for their children, they made an impossible choice. Laura, pregnant and terrified, agreed to disappear to protect both her children from Arthur's wrath. She got in a waiting car that would take her to her new lonely life in Havenwood. The memory Richard had of his mother crying and handing him over was real. She wasn't handing him to a nanny for the night. She was handing him over to Arthur's men, saying goodbye, forever. James, broken, returned with his father. But Arthur had one final cruel act to complete his victory. He didn't trust James. He worried that James would one day try to find Laura. So he had him committed. Holloway had found the records from a discreet, high-end psychiatric facility in upstate New York. James Blackwood was admitted 2 days after the boating accident, suffering from what was diagnosed as a severe psychotic break brought on by extreme trauma. He was kept there heavily medicated for the rest of his short life. The free-spirited musician was locked away. His memories chemically clouded his spirit, systematically dismantled until there was nothing left. He died 4 years later. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia. The unofficial cause was a broken heart. The conference room was utterly silent. Evelyn was sobbing quietly, mourning the parents she never knew, and the mother who had carried such a heavy secret. Richard was rigid, his face a mask of cold fury. His entire life, his identity, the memory of his father, the absence of his mother. It was all a lie, fabricated by the man he was raised to emulate. His grandfather hadn't just been controlling. He was a monster who had traded his own family's happiness for the sake of a name. The bitter truth was that they were not the survivors of a tragedy. They were the wreckage. Their parents had not been taken by the sea, but by the cold, calculating cruelty of one man. Richard had grown up a prince in a gilded cage, while James languished in a real one. Evelyn had grown up without a father, while Laura lived a half-life haunted by the family she had been forced to leave behind. The starburst birthmark was not a mark of destiny. It was the brand of a stolen legacy and a fractured family. The aftermath of the revelation was not a sunburst of joyous reunion. It was the quiet, disorienting calm after a devastating earthquake where the survivors walk through the rubble of their former lives, trying to comprehend the new landscape. The truth did not magically heal the wounds of the past. It exposed them in excruciating detail. Richard's first action was one of cold, precise fury. He had Jonathan Vance quietly and systematically dismantle the public legacy of Arthur Blackwood. The university wings, the museum galleries, the charitable foundations bearing his name. Richard withdrew all funding, issuing terse statements about realigning the company's philanthropic vision. To the world, it was a corporate restructuring. To Richard, it was the methodical erasure of a tyrant. He visited the grave where his grandfather was buried, a massive granite monument celebrating his life as a captain of industry. Richard didn't say a word. He just stood there for a long time, the silence his only eulogy before turning his back on it, forever. His relationship with Evelyn was awkward and fragile. They were siblings, bound by blood and a shared trauma, but they were also strangers. Their first few attempts at connection were stilted. Richard, accustomed to a life of solitude and control, didn't know how to be a brother. He tried to give her money to solve her problems with a wire transfer, seeing it as the only way he knew how to care for someone. "I don't want your money, Richard," she told him one afternoon in the sterile quiet of his penthouse. I want to know him. Our father. You knew him, even if it was just for a little while. What was he like?" And so they began to build a bridge across the chasm of their lost years. Not with money, but with memories. Richard dredged up the hazy, fragmented images from his early childhood, the feeling of being lifted onto strong shoulders, the sound of a guitar being strummed softly in the evening, a man's deep voice singing a lullaby. They were small, insignificant details he had suppressed for a lifetime, but to Evelyn they were precious jewels. In return, Evelyn told him about their mother. Not the tragic phantom figure of Elizabeth Blackwood, but Laura Reed, the warm, gentle librarian who read her stories every night, who planted sunflowers in their small garden, and who would sometimes stare off into the distance with a sadness in her eyes that Evelyn never understood until now. She showed him the box she kept under her bed, filled with Laura's few possessions, dried flowers, a book of poetry, and the handful of letters Daniel had sent her from the road before Arthur Blackwood had ripped their world apart. His handwriting was a bold artistic scrawl full of love and promises for a future that never came to be. Together, they visited the psychiatric facility where their father had been imprisoned. It had since been converted into a luxury spa, but the bones of the old building remained. They stood on the manicured lawns trying to imagine James Blackwood, the vibrant musician, trapped within those walls, his spirit slowly dimming. They also traveled to Havenwood, to the small house where Evelyn grew up. Richard walked through the rooms, touching the worn furniture, trying to feel the presence of the mother he had never known. He saw the sunflowers in the garden, and finally understood his own inexplicable fondness for them. There was no grand cinematic ending. There was no public revelation of the Blackwood family's dark secret. Richard chose to protect his parents' memory from the salacious glare of the media. The truth was for them, and them alone. Their new reality was a mosaic pieced together from broken fragments. Richard, the isolated billionaire, began to learn the meaning of family. He helped Evelyn finish her university degree, not by simply paying for it, but by attending her graduation. A proud, unfamiliar smile on his face. Evelyn, in turn, brought a warmth and humanity into his life that he never knew he was missing. She would call him to talk about her day, drag him to a noisy street festival, and remind him that there was a world beyond the boardroom. One evening they were sitting on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the vastness of Lake Michigan. It was the same body of water that had been the backdrop to his family's fictional demise. "Do you ever wonder what it would have been like?" Evelyn asked softly. "If they had made it, if we had all grown up together in that little house in Wisconsin." "Every day." Richard admitted, his voice quiet. "I think he would have taught us how to play the guitar. I think she would have read us stories. We would have been poor, probably. But we would have been together." They couldn't reclaim the lost years or undo the cruelty that had been inflicted upon their family. The ghosts of the past would always be with them, but as they sat there in the fading light, a brother and sister who had found each other against impossible odds, they were no longer defined by the tragedy that had created them. They were building something new, something that was entirely their own. It wasn't the life they were supposed to have, but it was a life finally that held the promise of a new dawn. The story of Richard and Evelyn is a powerful reminder that our identities are not always what they seem, and the past is never truly buried. It's a testament to the unbreakable bond of family and the gut-wrenching truth that some secrets are designed to shatter worlds. If their journey from a chance encounter over a birthmark to the discovery of a devastating family conspiracy moved you, please let us know in the comments below. What part of their story shocked you the most? We create these dramatic real-life stories to explore the depths of human connection and resilience. To ensure you don't miss our next gripping narrative, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story full of twists, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to keep bringing these incredible tales to light. Thank you for listening.